Yes, okay. Oh yeah, then we take off our masks when we speak.
Okay. Is our third judge back there ready? Cool. In that case, I'll begin. I affirm resolve, justice requires open borders for human migration. For clarity in the round, I'll provide the following definitions. An open border is a situation in which goods and people can enter and leave a country easily. Obviously, this only applies to people within the scope of the resolution, as the borders are for migration. Essentially, individuals are given the right to migrate freely. And human migration is the permanent or semi-permanent relocation of individuals, typically for the purposes of labor, safety, and/or freedom. Moving on to framework, the paramount value in today's round is justice. With ideas taken from John Rawls' theory of justice, justice can be defined as fairness, which has two pertinent principles within this round. First is the liberty principle, which states that governments or policy actions ought to act in a way that maximizes individuals' freedoms. This ensures that individuals are not unnecessarily burdened by unfair laws to restrict their liberties, particularly in areas such as free expression, in which exercising that right is not harmful to the general good. Second is the difference principle, which states that benefits ought to be directed primarily to those who are the least well off, as proportionately it will help them the most. Ultimately, the goal of the second principle is to provide a fair playing field for all, ensuring that barriers such as poverty are minimal and allowing everyone a fair chance at what they consider to be a good life. This perspective on justice is preferable in a migration debate, as the primary goal of opening borders is both to extend freedom and to benefit the least well off. Thus, this form of justice follows from the specified value in the resolution. Thus, our value criterion should be individual autonomy. Individual autonomy is the ability of an individual to act in their own self-interest and control their own outcomes without compromising the autonomy of others. Autonomy is the best way to uphold our value of justice in a few key ways. First, it satisfies the liberty principle of justice, as they're practically the same. If you can exercise autonomy, you can exercise liberty. Additionally, autonomy, and particularly in the context of this resolution, allows individuals to satisfy the difference principle for themselves. The difference principle primarily acts to give fair opportunity to all, and the most important prerequisite to opportunity is the ability to take advantage of it, which comes directly from autonomy. Contention 1, economic lottery. The country in which you were born has incredible effects on your education, wealth, and even health. Max Rosen, a research director at Oxford, quantifies that, quote, in countries where people have the best access to education, children of school entrance age today can expect 15 to 20 years of formal education. Children entering school at the same time in countries with the poorest access to education can only expect 5 years. And additionally, children tend to learn much less in schools in poorer countries. Furthermore, the health of children is highly correlated to your birthplace. Again, quoting Rosen, quote, a child born in one of these countries with the worst health is 60 times more likely to die than a child born in one with the best health, end quote. The ability of a parent to move their family out of these locations, or the ability of an individual to start a new generation outside of this area in which they grew up, is fundamental to justice. Finally, and possibly most prominently, is the difference in wealth. Quote, if you look at average incomes and compare the richest country, Qatar with a GDP per capita of almost $117,000, to the poorest country in the world, the Central African Republic at $661, then you find a 177-fold difference. This is taking into account price differences between countries. To give another example, the US has a GDP per capita of $54,000 and Switzerland of $57,000. This means that the Swiss can spend in 1 month what people in the Central African Republic spend in 7 years. Ultimately, location is incredibly important to your wealth. Without the ability to purchase basic items for sustenance, hygiene, and safety, it severely hinders the autonomy of the individual, as you can't do what you want if you're constantly working to make ends meet. Finally, Rosen says, where you live isn't just more important than all your other characteristics. It's more important than all of them put together. Thankfully, through migration, we are able to solve these impacts. The United Nations Human Development Report found that, in 2009, quote, migrants from low Human Development Index countries saw on average a 15-fold increase in income, a doubling in education enrollment rate, and a 16-fold reduction in child mortality. The best way to amend your disadvantaged position is the ability to migrate, which is exactly why we have to open borders to satisfy justice. Without the freedom and autonomy to migrate, you forfeit the freedom and autonomy to improve your own position, which is the least that you are owed in a just society. Contention 2, the moral lottery. In addition to a fickle economic position, this birth lottery also relates to the government of the country in which you were born. According to modern philosophy, legitimate governments are based in a social contract. Essentially, every citizen consensually gives up freedom and/or property in exchange for some benefits, be it safety, welfare, community, order, or anything else. If any part of this is not fulfilled, then that government is illegitimate, and keeping a citizen there would violate their autonomy. When you are born, you have no way to choose the country in which you live, which is exactly why we need open borders. In a world without open borders, how can one escape an authoritarian regime that oppresses them? How can one escape religious persecution? Or on a less extreme level, how can someone find a government that fits their ideals properly? On the most basic level, all social contract theory requires consent. It requires that participants choose to take part in their governing body. If you can't leave, or if you have no other options, can you consent to being governed? Consent requires choice, and no matter how okay you are with your current government, if you have no capability to exercise your own autonomy in terms of subscribing to the form of government with which you agree most, it cannot be said to be just. A lack of choice is coercive, regardless of what I'm already given, when there are other possibilities. This is a blatant attack on one's individual autonomy, which in turn leads to a violation of justice. Thus, borders must remain open, as not allowing citizens in or out is a symptom of an unjust state. Thus, I stand affirmation. Thank you.
Alright, is my opponent ready? Oh, I need a drink before class. Alright. Do you need one or no?
I can drink it.
Okay. Alright, judges ready? Audience ready? Alright, then let's begin. To start off with your value of justice as fairness, is it fair to say that if there's a law that is just, that achieves your justice, your value, correct?
Could you
Like,
clarify what you mean by that?
it specifies that we should, not have unfair laws to maximize freedom. So if we were to have a fair law, that would be maximizing freedoms, correct?
I mean, yeah, obviously all of the policies that we either choose to implement or choose not to implement should be in the pursuit of justice and fairness.
Awesome. You talk about the value criterion of individual autonomy, but how much choice are we allowing people before it actually harms people? Like, where do we stop giving people choice before it harms?
As I stated in my value criterion, the ability of autonomy only extends to the point that you are violating someone else's autonomy.
All right, so in the context of individual autonomy, is it direct harms or indirect harms?
I mean, it could be both, but it's a case-by-case basis.
All right, so is there an example that you can provide where an indirect harm would be, like, just? So like if the choice of someone to migrate inherently harmed a country, but that was individual autonomy, would that be an indirect harm in the affirmative world?
I presume it would be an indirect harm. I mean, we're talking in like completely outside of the realm of specifics here.
Awesome. Let's move into your contingent one where you talk about the lottery of birth. How will opening borders actually help the least well off if they still don't have the resources to move in the first place?
I mean, they don't have the resources to move in your world either then, and obviously these restrictions are not making it any easier for individuals who have to pay for smugglers to get them into these countries, when instead they could simply pay for a plane ticket or something like that.
All right, then how does the affirmative solve for global poverty then if they can't actually move out of their country?
I'm not trying to completely solve for global poverty, I'm just trying to make the world a better place.
Awesome. And you also, my next question on this contingent one is how will the class of someone dramatically shift just by moving to another country? If they're the least well off in one country, will they be the richest in another country?
I mean, they won't go from the poorest in one country to the richest in another country necessarily, but that's not the affirmative burden to prove that you'll go from the poorest to the richest. I'm simply saying I'm giving these people a fair chance at life, and I think a 60 times increase in the probability of your children surviving is a pretty big difference.
Awesome. On your contingent two, you talked about the moral lottery. Where do we like draw the line where people just disagree with laws? So if they don't agree with the law that is securing their democracy or their state and they're just leaving, how do we keep a checks and balances in the affirmative world?
I mean, if you disagree fundamentally with how your state is running their government, and you have an obligation to either do something about it within that state, or if you're incapable of doing that, then you could leave and subscribe to another form of government.
All right, then how do we ensure that reform is actually quality reform and not just reform for the fact of reform?
I don't really see the impact or why we'd have reform for the sake of reform. There's always a reason to have reform. They're fixing something.
Awesome. That's gross. I'll be taking a little bit of prep before my speech. I'm starting now. Use 312. Alright, the order will be the negative case, then the affirmative case. Is everyone ready? Alright, then let's begin. Today, I negate the resolution resolved. Justice requires open borders for human migration. Offer the following definitions for clarification. Open borders, defined by World Population Review, refers to a system that allows people to pass through borders without checks, proof of anything, or allowance to enter another country. Today, I offer the value of justice, defined as to each their due, leading me to my value criterion of security. Mabe 08 writes that security is a political principle with the primary function to guarantee national and international peace. Governments have the obligation to their citizens to be secure first, to give each citizen their due. Essentially, justice requires that a state must be secure in terms of its political process and the safety of their citizens. Contention 1, increased trafficking and crime. The Schengen Agreement highlights problems with open border policy regarding trafficking. The Van Vollenhoven Institute writes that free movements in the Schengen area is a source of challenges. European member states face the challenge of transnational crimes. Concerns about mobility have been present from the very state of the Schengen Agreement, with countries being weary of unwanted individuals, whether it be irregular migrants or criminals. The West Mediterranean route is increasingly chosen by migrants wanting to join Europe to pursue their journey northwards. As a consequence, EU member states have to deal with the complex and intense migration flows. Migrants have a particularly vulnerable position and become easily clients of choice for smugglers and traffickers. Lack of knowledge on the overlap between these two complex phenomena not only hinder their understanding and create substantial obstacles to combat the networks and actors involved in the business of trafficking and smuggling and to help those in need. In the status quo, undocumented immigrants pose a threat to security and justice. Hernandez 21 writes that smugglers try to avoid border patrol checkpoints using back roads, going off-road, crashing through ranch fences, and driving dangerously fast. Tiny law enforcement agencies act as a second layer of border enforcement apparatuses that tries to stop smugglers, drugs, and undocumented immigrants before they disappear into big cities. The impact is that people are moving. When analyzing the argument of trafficking, we need to understand that open borders would only increase the problems that we see in the status quo. Drug, human, and sex trafficking would see an increase. Furthermore, the harms would never be solved. The lack of checks allows for crimes to be evaded in various different countries, leading to a lack of enforcement. Not only would the law be evaded and broken, but open borders harms the resources that are being utilized by law enforcement within different countries. Contention 2. Restricted borders are better for justice. Justice does not require for borders to be open all the time, nor to all people, specifically in the context of security. Subpoint A is national security. By allowing for checks to be eliminated in the name of free movement between states is not a risk that can and should not be taken. By allowing for checks to still occur, a restrictive border model is better for justice. The Institute for Government 20 writes that border checks are required to ensure that any applicable tariffs or duties are unpaid and that imported good meets the relevant standards in areas such as food and product safety and disease control to prevent smuggling and illicit activity and to comply with international obligations. Gatekeeper Security 22 writes that border security is looked at one of the most important aspects of security for many nations around the globe. Security checkpoints are usually some of the first places that security personnel can stop potential threats or crime. Subpoint B is secure democracies. Limiting when and who can enter a country allows for democracies to be secure in terms of public services and servants of the public. Rebello 20 writes that America had an open immigration policy until the 1880s. Such a policy could never be reinstated in the modern era. What had changed was that public services have ballooned since the days of free immigration. The United States would be flooded by low-skilled immigrants from all over the world, straining the government's resources and forcing it to levy additional taxes to compensate. Thus, Friedman argued a country could either choose to have generous welfare state or to have open borders to immigration, but not both. For open border policies to be executed, welfare systems cannot exist at the same time. Open border policy leads to politicians being less accountable to their elected democracy. Ansari 19 writes that the liberal perspective is that there is a moral responsibility to those outside a nation's border. May be admirable, but what is missing is the reality that the primary responsibility of elected political leaders is to voters inside their borders. The limits to open borders are partly a function of a democracy. When allowing for borders to be open with no checks, it allows for political leaders to not actually incite true and quality reform. This is not just. We see three clear harms. First, quality public welfare is sacrificed. Secondly, accountability is evaded by political leaders. And three, an influx of crime within the state. It is for these reasons that I offer a negative ballot in today's debate. I'll be now moving on to the affirmative side of the flow. First, my opponent's value of justice as fairness. My opponent essentially said that it should be fair and that we should be looking at the liberty principle and the difference principle. A couple main responses. If the law is just, then we should be implementing it in society, so prefer the negative case, which prefers a restrictive border model through national security and secure democracies. If we actually want to have a quality state, we need to have checks and balances, and a restrictive border model looks at that. And for example, you can refer to my contention too. Moving on to the value criterion. We need to prefer security as a prerequisite to autonomy. For people to have the choice of anything in society, they have to be secure first, in service to the public welfare, and their physical autonomy of their bodies. So we can't have choice if people are not secure. Moving on to my opponent's contention 1 of the lottery of birth. A couple main responses. Firstly, moving to another country does not actually mitigate poverty. The impact weighs less in the affirmative world because the link cannot be accessed if you cannot move in the first place. This is contradictory to the difference principle in my opponent's value framework. The second main response is that if someone is the least well off in one country, their life is not going to dramatically change just moving to another country. It's the least well off to the least well off, which means that there is no inherent just action actually happening, which means my opponent's impact weighs less as well. I'd like to read a piece of evidence that writes that inequalities are not unique unique to open borders. Brown 20 writes that in fact, one does not need to cross state borders to encounter enormous inequalities in income and wealth. We essentially can see that moving does not actually solve any inequality disparities whatsoever. So moving to my opponent's contention 2 of the moral lottery. The first response is that in an open border system, inequalities will still happen on race. So moving to a different country does not actually solve for this. Ray 22 writes that there are many reports of black people being refused at border crossings in favor of white Ukrainians, leaving them stuck at borders for days in brutal conditions. What we can see in the context of Ukraine is that in an open border policy, there's still discrimination on the basis of race, which means that people leaving because they're being discriminated in their country does not actually mean it's going to solve for this impact. The second main response is on checks and balances. There's no bright line in this contention whatsoever saying where we need to draw the line to have laws. So if people are able to just leave whenever they want, that means they can evade the law, that they can just leave, and that there will not actually be a link to quality reform. If people are moving to have a better life and going to places with quality reform, then there's going to be no quality reform if it's being decreased by open border policies and migration. So it is for these reasons that I offer a negative ballot in today's debate. Thank you. I'm now open for cross-examination.
Is everyone ready? Then let's begin. Okay, starting out with your attack you just made on my second contention, you said that on the Ukraine border there were people who were being denied into or out of Ukraine because of the color of their skin, correct?
Correct.
And you called this an open border?
Correct.
How is that an open border if they were being denied at the border?
Well, we see that there was an open border for all people who were coming from Ukraine because of the Ukrainian, the problems in Ukraine essentially, but people were being denied on the basis of race, which is discriminatory and it's not a condition. That's a problem because it's an open border policy saying everyone should be welcome, but they're being denied on the basis of race, which is just discrimination.
Okay, perfect. But you consider that to be an open border?
Correct.
Okay, so your definition of open borders is essentially a border that's open without any sort of checks or any proof of anything. Who was stopping them at this border that you consider to be open?
Essentially the people in that government, I would say, or the people there, because there's still checks for, like, because it's human migration as in your definition. So they're still checking for things such as animals or drugs.
So there will still be security checkpoints at open borders?
Yes, but for different things, such as humans.
What different?
So which I just said, like drugs, cartel, trades, it's just like
so they'll
animals.
be checking for things that are illegal?
Correct.
Okay.
There's not laws that are being eliminated. It's that open borders versus restricted borders.
So we still have laws in an affirmative world?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Additionally, on this contention, you stated that people would simply be able to leave and avoid law, and this is something throughout your case, they would simply leave to avoid law and we wouldn't see any real reform, correct?
Correct.
Would you consider the borders between states in the United States to be open?
Can you clarify your question?
If I want to pack up and move to Pennsylvania right now, is it pretty easy for me to do so?
Yeah, you could say that.
Okay, so are the borders open in the United States?
Yes, you could say that with internally.
Okay, perfect. So do we see reform in laws at a state level, and do we have laws at a state level within the United States?
You could say that.
Okay, but people are able to go to other states?
Yeah, you could say that.
Okay, wonderful, thank you. Now, looking into your first contention, I just wanted to clarify, some of these smugglers and these undocumented immigrants that you talked about, they're engaging in dangerous activities to get over borders in the current world?
Yes, but we have to also look at the Van Vol and Hoven Institute piece of evidence, which talks about with an open border policy between countries, that this activity is still happening and it's actually increasing. So the impact is still bad.
Okay. And just to clarify, did you have any sort of empirical evidence talking about how much of this trafficking or how much of this crime we would see with open borders?
The card specifically said that there's an increase, and I can send you this piece of evidence after cross.
Okay, perfect, thank you. And then finally, on your point about public services, so if a country is, there are more people migrating there and they're less able to care for all of their citizens, would people continue to migrate there if they saw that happening?
Well, the link is essentially saying that if, for example, let's say a county leader has accountability for 400 people, but then they have to account for all the people that are coming in at random times, that means that their public welfare is going to decrease. So that's not inherently net good at all.
Okay, thank you, that's done.
Would you like the piece of evidence?
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, yeah, you could look at it. I just need my computer. I'll just email it to you for prep.
Okay.
Well, because I need my computer.
I'll just run some prep then.
Okay.
I can-
I would like to know. Colin, what's your email?
10 seconds, starting here. Alright, about 335 news. As our brief time roadmap, I'll go over definitions in the framework, then my case and my opponent's case.
Would you like me to repeat that?
Yeah, framework and definitions, my case, your case.
Awesome.
Is everyone ready? Then we'll begin. Starting out with definitions, my opponent provided some alternative definitions of an open border, for example, essentially having no checks whatsoever, but they gave no attacks on my definitions, and additionally in cross they admitted that yes, open borders can and do have border checks and border security, so this is just a reasonable way of defining it. If we're going to have these borders only for human migration, we're going to have checks to stop things like drug trafficking and human trafficking and these things that are very much illegal. We're not eliminating laws in an affirmative way. Moving into framework, my opponent, in attacking my value, just essentially says that we should prefer the negative case. They don't really attack the validity of my framework, but our values are fairly similar. If we can just say that what people are due is fairness and we can use these principles, then that's going to be effective within this round. And then moving into the value criterion debate, my opponent says that we need to prefer security because security is a prerequisite to autonomy. But autonomy actually includes security, and I gave this in my definition of autonomy. It's the ability to exercise your own freedom until you violate someone else's autonomy. And if you are doing something that makes someone else unsafe, that is violating their autonomy. That is violating their ability to be free. So we are including that. We're including that security within my value criterion, but we're also ensuring that we are maximizing freedom for individuals, which is not something that my opponent's value criterion talks about at all. So if you want a holistic framework, we have to prefer the affirmative framework here. Now moving into my first contention, my opponent had a few key attacks here. First of all, that this is not going to be something that completely eliminates poverty because some people won't be able to move out of poverty. But this is not something my opponent is solving for in any way. And additionally, we have to just give rights based on if it's the correct thing to do. If they don't have the capability to do something, both because they don't have the money and because the government doesn't give them the right, that's not helping them at all, and it doesn't give them any future opportunity. And there are many individuals who would be able to take advantage of this, but because there are heavy border restrictions, they simply cannot do so in today's world. Additionally, my opponent says that your life would not dramatically change just simply because you would move to another country. But I gave you the card that talks about a 15-fold increase in income, a doubling in education rate, and a 16-fold reduction in child mortality. That sounds pretty drastic to me. And finally, my opponent says that you can find inequality everywhere. Yes, this is true in both cases. I'm simply acting to make the world a slightly better place. And moving into my second contention, my opponent talks about how there can still be racism and problem at these borders. But if these people are being explicitly denied access into a country because of their race, that's not an open border. They're not being allowed to freely migrate, so that's not the affirmative position. And then my opponent makes this comparison about how people could be simply evading the law by leaving. But we see in the United States, my opponent agrees, we have open borders between states, and we don't see individuals just running state to state all the time and that there's no reform. We have laws and it works as a system. We can have open borders and have laws too. Now moving into my opponent's first contention about trafficking and crime. My opponent says here that smugglers and undocumented immigrants can act very dangerously in trying to avoid these heavy border checks. This is actually a point for the affirmative. If people are speeding and doing dangerous things just to avoid these checks that are stopping them from getting into a country, wouldn't we rather them simply work with the law and work with safe mechanisms to get into the country so that they don't have to end up in these regards? And we're still protecting for things such as safety and stopping drug trafficking because we have these border checks, but we want them to act in accordance with the law because that is going to be the safest thing for them, and that flows under either framework. And then moving into my opponent's second contention, the first subpoint was entirely justified by the idea that we need to have border checks, but my opponent agrees that we can have border checks for things like safety in an affirmative world, so this is just dropped from the round. And on the second subpoint about securing democracy, first of all, just because there are more people going into a state doesn't mean they're suddenly unable to provide welfare. It's not going to be instantaneous and immediate. We have immigration and we're still able to support welfare policies, and ultimately these governments should be accountable to everyone who wants to be a part of them because that's what is ultimately just. Thus, I stand in affirmation. Thank you.
I'll be using my remaining 40 seconds. The order will be definitions, negative case, affirmative case. Judges ready? All ready? Alright, then let's begin. Alright, starting off with the definition of open borders, the definition that I read was more of essentially not the negative case, because there's a whole contention too where I talk about why checks and security is better. So the negative is not advocating for unrestricted borders to not have checks. So I turn this burden back to my opponent in this round. So moving on to the negative case in today's round, my opponent has a couple main responses. First, on security. My opponent says that we cannot violate others, but forgets in cross-examination when they said that indirect harms are harmful to justice. So if there are indirect harms that the negative has outlined within their speech, which my opponent has left unaddressed, that is still violating justice, and my opponent is not showing why this is each their due, which is harmful to the liberty principle and harmful to the difference principle as well. Furthermore, let's move on to the conditional level debate. My opponent said that we can work with law enforcement and to turn this to the affirmative. But if we're supposed to be working with law enforcement, then why is in the Ukrainian example, they're not actually doing their job? The check is supposed to be there on not things like on things such as drugs, animals, and other things that are not human migration. But what we see is that discrimination is actually increasing in the terms of people that are black at the border. The card extends in rights. There are even reports of animals being allowed on trains before Africans. So we can see that people are being discriminated more when there's open border policies. Turn to the Van Vollenhoven Institute card, which also talks about in the Schengen Agreement, when there's open border policies between countries, that there's an increased rate of trafficking and smugglers, which is harder to track. So people are not actually doing what they're supposed to be doing with open border policies, which means we have to have a new one, which is restricted borders. So move on to my contention 2, which was very minimally addressed. First, my opponent brings up the definitional debate on my subpoint A and says that because of the definitional debate, you can just turn this to the app. But the whole advocacy of the negative is to have border checks and security, so this impact decreases on magnitude. Now let's move to my subpoint B of secure democracies. My opponent says that the government should be helping everyone, but this is not actually feasible whatsoever. If the government has an obligation to every single person in the world, that means that the quality of the reform, the quality of the welfare, and the quality of the state will actually be reduced, which means there's no point for migration at that point because everyone will be back. So if we're actually gonna have a societal benefit, we need to either have quality welfare and reform or an open border policy. And the negative chooses the latter. Furthermore, my opponent says that we can have welfare, but doesn't really tell you why. And the negative tells you why welfare cannot exist at the same time as an open border policy, which means you should prefer the negative. Let's move on to the affirmative case. A couple of main responses to my opponent's contention 1. My opponent says that they're just trying to make this a slightly better place, but there's actually no impact because they're not changing anything at all. Firstly, my opponent tells you that because they're able to have this, they just throw out these empirical evidence. But what is actually going to happen is that if people are in the least well off, the bottom of the income spectrum, they're not going to have access to actually move their country to another country, which means that they have no access to their impact in the first place, which means that you cannot prefer that impact. Secondly, on the Brown 20 argument, my opponent claims in this contention that they're solving for inequalities on the basis of class, but inequalities exist everywhere, so there's no real solvency whatsoever, which means you're moving from the least well off again to the least well off. Moving to the responses on the contention 2. Firstly, my opponent says that laws will still exist. You can cross-apply the Ukrainian example and the Van Vollenhoven Institute card to this and extend that through the flow. Furthermore, the link is between the checks that were supposed to be there and not doing their job. There were supposed to be an open borders for humans to enter a new country, and this is not the case. People are still being discriminated on. Furthermore, my opponent just says that this is not the affirmative position, but doesn't really tell you what the affirmative position is, which means there's no bright line on this argument or no warrant as well. So do not let them just tell you that. So a couple main voting issues. Firstly, about global inequalities. Firstly, we can see that global inequalities will not actually be solved in the affirmative world for a couple main reasons. First, we see that if you cannot access to leave your country in the first place, then an open border policy is not helping you, which is contradictory to the difference principle and contradictory to the liberty principle, which means my opponent can't uphold their value criterion. Secondly, it's also just moving from the least well off to the least well off as well, which means essentially that their global inequalities are not changing whatsoever. It means that their society is not being helped, which means we should not prefer the affirmative. Thirdly, their main response is inequalities exist everywhere, so there's really no impact as well, which means it decreases on magnitude. Moving to the second main voter issue is on framework. The negative has one framework because you have to be secure to actually have a choice to do anything. If there's no public welfare that's actually being secure in a society, there's no accountability within political leaders, that means that nothing is actually being changed, which means you have no choice, which actually increases corrupt states than actually decreases them. The third and main voter issue is on the flow. The negation has won majority of the argumentation. First is on my opponent's contention 1 of the lottery of birth on the inequalities argument. The second on my opponent's contention 2, which talks about the moral lottery, which my opponent is really not touched in today's debate and just says it's not the affirmative position. Let's move on to the negative side of the flow. We can look to my contention 1 where my opponent talks about protecting security and we should just do either this or prefer the affirmative. But the negative has shown you why through the Van Vollenhoven Institute card, the Ray 22 card, and shown you that security is not actually being protected in an open border world, which means we need restrictive borders. Moving on to the contention 1, contention 2, this was really not addressed at all, which is the main voter issue and what is most important, which means we should prefer restrictive border policies within a society. So it is for these reasons that having restrictive border policies is the most just thing that we can vote on. So prefer negative. Thank you.
All right, I'll go and take 25 seconds. I'll go for framework and then summarize the round with some key voting issues. Is everyone ready? Okay. And let's begin. Going to framework, obviously we agree on the value of justice, and in the value criterion debate, we have to look here to autonomy. And the reason for that, the reason that I detailed in my last speech, is that autonomy includes security. It's autonomy up until the point that you're violating someone else's autonomy. And if you're violating someone else's autonomy, that could be a threat to security. So if we want to have a holistic picture of the round, we have to look to autonomy here. My opponent talks about indirect harms, but ultimately, if this is a harm to autonomy, if it's an indirect harm to someone's autonomy, it's still weighed within the round. It's still weighed under my framework. And there really hasn't been a substantive response to the fact that my opponent's value criterion is simply included within mine, while also looking to more impacts, which gives us a better picture of the round. Now that we are weighing under the affirmative framework here, let's move into some key voting issues. The first key voting issue that I have for you today is the benefits of the affirmative world. When we look to my first contention and we see the benefits to education and to health and to wealth and the things that happen directly as a result of migration, this doubling of education, this huge increase in survival rate for children, and this benefit to your income, these are the benefits that the affirmative world is providing. And we're providing it to as many people as we reasonably can. My opponent throughout today's round has talked about how we're not completely solving for all poverty throughout the world, which is actually going to be my second key voting issue, is the affirmative burden here. I'm not trying to solve global poverty. That was never the goal of the affirmative. The goal of open border policy is not to completely eliminate poverty or completely eliminate inequity. It's simply to build a better world. It's simply to build a world where some people in the negative world would be able to access these benefits who can't now. And my opponent talks about how there would still be some extremely poor individuals who wouldn't be able to access these benefits. But they aren't able to access the benefits in their world either. And there are more people like that in their world who aren't able to access these benefits. So if you want to provide safety and security and greater income and these benefits to a far wider set of people, and to give more people their autonomy, or even to give more people their security because they're able to provide for themselves and they're more likely to live with health-related issues, then you have to affirm today. You have to give people the freedom to move to the countries which they would like to move, because ultimately that is something incredibly important in today's round. Additionally, I would like to address the issue of border checks, because my opponent has admitted in today's round that an open border had border checks. It was on the border of Ukraine. I was asking them directly, they had border checks, but they are an open border. And my opponent said yes. We were talking that these countries can still and would still have checks on security for these reasons, which negates the vast majority of my opponent's arguments. Now, just to frame the affirmative position here, if we want to live in the affirmative world, that's a world where people are free. It's a world where people are free to better their own position and to better the positions of those around them and in their family. It's a world where people are free to choose their government, to choose their way of life, and to choose the laws that don't oppress them, and simply the ones with which they agree most. And those impacts are simply ones that you do not see in a negative world. For these reasons, I stand after nation.